Today on the Perception and Action podcast, reconceptualizing movement behavior in sports as solving alive problems. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action podcast, back with another article review. In today's episode, I want to look at, we can visit the idea of movement as problem solving. Right. So what I want to talk about today is an article by, friends of the podcast, Sean Miska and Tyler Yerby from Emergence and Keith Davids, reconceptualizing movement behavior in sport as a problem-solving activity. So I think this paper, a full disclosure too, I was the editor on this paper, so I'm very familiar with it. What I would like to do, I think the authors do a really good job of extending this common idea we put forward and putting a little meat on the bones of it using ecological dynamics, right? What exactly do we mean when we say a movement solution, right? Solving a problem, right? So that's what they're going to try to do in this paper, right? So we have lots of, this idea is not new. It's been put forth multiple times. Bernstein's quote, being skillful is not a process of repeating a solution. It's repeating the process of finding a solution, right? The idea that sport becomes a problem-solving activity in which movements are used to produce the necessary solution. Again, Bernstein's dexterity is the ability to find a motor solution for any external situation that is adequately solve an emerging movement problem, right? So the idea that we're faced with these problems in our environment, and that what we're trying to do is find a solution to them. The movement behavior that emerges in sports can be viewed as a problem-solving activity for the athlete, where integrated movement solutions are underpinned by intertwined processes of perception, cognition, and action. Right. One of the things the authors do in this paper really nicely is go beyond, right? We all know the degrees of freedom of problem, right? That's really just one part of the problem we're going to try to solve. So finding a movement solution is not just coordinating degrees of freedom. That's a part of it. That's the action part of it. There's also perceptual parts of it, and there's cognitive parts of it. Okay. So they do a good job. So let's go through what they do. Okay. So the background. The purpose of this conceptual analysis is to adopt an ecological perspective and valuing theory and evidence as how athletes may solve movement problems in sport, right? So that's what they're going to try to do in this. They try to do in this paper. Okay. So problem solving. When you hear the term problem solving, usually problem solving is pitched in a very cognitive psychology idea, information processing, the idea that problem solving involves individuals have interpretation of information, processing of incomplete information, creating internal models, representations. That's what we think of. A lot of people think of when they hear problem solving. What the authors want to do is kind of flip this on its head, right? This idea of problem solving. So instead of just relying on knowledge about the environment stored in long-term memory, athletes are required to interact with information that is continually emerging, changing, and unpredictable, relevant to organically resolving an alive movement problem, which will differ subtly or significantly each time it's faced. At a certain level, no two problems in sport are ever truly the same. Thus, no two solutions will be the same either. Right? So that important concept of an alive, that problems are alive, right? We're going to get to that, what we mean by that, and how to actually test. You ask whether we're creating alive movement problems in practice. So this paper is going to have a lot of implications for practice as well. But so we're rejecting the common idea of cognitive psychology view of problem solving, right? This notion implies that scientists should not analyze or attempt to understand movement solutions in isolation without paying respect to the contextual problem that behavior is organized, right? You can't understand the solution we make out of context, right? Because it's you can't separate an organism from their environment, right? So a lot of classic ecological ideas here. Okay. So in this, they talk about this problem-solving process, and they create this. They talk about it as an integrated process of perception, cognition, and action. Okay. So although they can separate them in this figure and break them apart, right? The key idea of ecological psychology, right? Ecological psychology sometimes is is the idea. People have this idea that we reject the role of cognition and memory. There's no memory, no cognition in ecological psychology. That's not true. It's just that we reject the idea that it's a discrete step, right? That's involved. So it's not perceive, take in information, cognition, interpret, process, act, right? Then decide what to do and act, right? So they're not separate linear steps, right? In the ecological process, they happen all at the same time. They happen over an extended period, right? So the one of the things that Gibson really rejected, and Turvey has kind of pushed this to, is the separation between perception and cognition, right? The idea that perceiving is just passively taking the information, and cognitive is interpreting it, right? So they talk about, when we get exposure to practice, right, we're going to tune to different variables, right? We're going to educate our attention, things like that, right? So that's the perceptual part, picking up the information, right? The cognitive part is, intentions, decisions, memory, these things that we typically think of as, being internal processing. They're part and parcel of the whole process. And then action is an expression of cognition, right? Where we reorganize degrees of freedom, right? So there's questions raised, lack of explanation about how cognition may work in ecological theories. Perception is considered as a fundamental type of cognition, right? So the idea here is that when you attune and educate your attention to the right perceptual variables, you've done half the problem. That's an intelligent process, right? That is not just passive pickup of information. So you're doing part of the cognition. We also have the, cognition may be considered the coordination of intended interactions with the performance environment. So we're getting into ideas of skilled intentionality here, right? We're aligning our pickup of information and our decisions with our intentions, which are changing over time. And they define cognition, a set of capacities by which observers gain knowledge of their environment. Cognition provided by perception could support athletes' knowledge of the environment, allowing them to be aware of events, objects, and others that exist and have existed. As we talked about before, perception is a cognitive function of the most essential kind because it yields knowledge of affordances available in the performance environment. Right. So perception is an intelligent so these things are all interlinked, right? You can't separate them into discrete steps. Here's an example. For example, if a basketball player perceptually picks up a teammate entering the paint near the basket, the ball handler needs to be tuned in to the available information in the perceptual environment for an affordance. E.g., a passing lane open up to throw the ball to a moving teammate that invites a quick pass from behind the three-point line. Following Gibson's idea, when the teammate is detected near the opponent's basket, the point guard's perceptual system resonates with that information or affordance, right? So people that are opponents of don't like ecological psychology probably had just exploded, right? Using the words tuned in and the concept of resonance, right, are very unsatisfactory because they're not mechanistic, right? The idea that the idea that we need some process, we need to understand the mechanics involved in how you pick up information. That's only if you take an information processing view, right? If you take the idea that the perceptual system's job is not to interpret, but just to pick up and detect, right? Then the resonating is just connecting with, right? So that's kind of the fundamental idea. Instead, perception cognition could be sort of linked as interacting elements in one integrated movement solution, right? So we have all these processes going on. We have picking up, specifying information. We have changing our intentions, being skilled intentionality. And then, of course, we have the intelligence in our movement, coordinative structures, and so on. So all these things are happening together, right? We can't separate them into discrete linear steps, okay? The other thing they do nicely is talk about how we're reorganizing degrees of freedom, not just at the movement level, right? So the problem solving they're talking about is not just to solving the degrees of freedom, but also solving perceptual and cognitive degrees of freedom, right? And I've tried to do this over the year in my book, and many times to talk about the parallels between what Bernstein was trying to do and what Gibson was trying to do, right? They both have too many degrees of freedom, right? Bernstein had too many degrees of freedom in ways you can move. Gibson had too many degrees of freedom in terms of information, right? Too many the perceptual variables, things you could pick up, right? They're both trying to solve. There's also cognitive degrees of freedom in terms of the possible intentions you could have, right? And how you realize them, right? So we're trying to solve all three of these degrees of freedom problems at the same time, right? We're solving the action one by coordinated structures, doing by motor synergies, the perceptual one by picking up higher order information, the cognitive one through skilled intentionality, right? So we're doing all these things. So perception can unfold through a variety of interconnected subsystems, visual, auditory, haptic, all combining to varying degrees of freedom to provide the athlete with functional contact with the world as they attempt to detect the most relevant information regarding opportunities present for authentically solving a particular problem. So we have all these different information sources, detecting this higher order. We're trying to find the specifying information, the information that is specific to what we want to achieve. Closely connected to perception, the athlete cognitive degrees of freedom can also be coordinated in various ways, led by constantly changing intentional aims. The diverse thoughts they may have, their unfolding movement strategies, the wide range of decisions they can make, right? So your intentions to pass, to shoot, whatever, are going to be constantly changing as you move through the environment, right? You're going to, you're solving, doing this kind of reorganization all along at these three levels at the same time. I know that's complicated and we can't draw out a nice linear path, right? But we accept that, right? I think that's part of the thing I see sometimes with ecological. The ecological approach sometimes people think is ignoring things, right? But it's not. It's accepting the fact that this is a complicated interactive process, right? The next thing they do is bring in the concept of affordances, right? So affordances give us information about the relationship with the world, right? What we can do with it. They bring in the idea that the affordances create a functional semantics for sports. And this is the idea that really Turvey really put forth. Semantics means meaning, right? It creates a meaningful environment. So they're not just possibilities for action, they're the invitations, right? And they use the quote, I think the world is its best model, right? What they mean by that, right? We don't an internal model when the environment itself has intelligence, structure, and meaning, right? By the way the light and other sensory is structured, the environment that reaches, it creates meaning, it creates functional semantics, functional meaning of the world, right? Opportunities for action, right, are created through the affordances that we pick up. Okay, so that's the idea there. Okay, information, as noted, the potential affordances connecting the athlete and environment system are specified by information provided by their energy array, how our environment structures sound, how it structures light, how it structures, proprioceptive, gives it meaning, right? There's intelligence in the outside world that we can pick it up. We don't need to add all the intelligence ourselves. Movement solutions will emerge depending on the athlete's detection of coupling to these relevant information sources, right? So that's again how we do this. So part of the problem, the idea is in ecology we solve most of the problem by just picking up the right thing, right? Because intelligence is not just in our head; it's also in the outside world. Okay, it would seem that information pertaining to one of the things they focus on is a particular variable, right? Interpersonal distance, right? The distance between you and an opponent, you and a teammate, is particularly relevant in sports. It specifies affordances, channels this problem solving. As they use Gibson quote, behavior affords behavior. What he meant by that is when we move, we change this information variable, which changes the affordances, right? So the causal circularity between perception action we see there. Okay. So that's kind of their model. So they put some kind of weight onto this information. So the problem solving is not just talking about movement coordination at degrees of freedom. It's perception, action, and cognition all at the same time, right? So that's one of the key points. So from there, they do have some implication for research, but I want to focus on the information for practice design and coaches. Okay. So coaches should aim to set alive movement problems to the athlete in practice and training, right? That word alive. what do we mean by alive, right? What we mean by alive is there's multiple affordances available. There's multiple opportunities, multiple decision intentions you could achieve that are changing, that are dynamic. They're decaying and emerging, new ones all the time. Okay. Even so, that's what we mean by alive. Yet many training environments or practice assessments often contain a highly sterile and predictable task, which expect an athlete to simply repeat an idealized motor response with little emergent problem solving or decision making. To assist the equivalent of less alive movement problems consisting of dead technical patterns, right? They're dead in the sense that they're not changing, they're not dynamic, they're predictable. To assist coaching practitioners in designing more live movement problems, it's they include a table with some questions you can ask. Like take any drill. It's kind of similar to the representative practice assessment tool that I've talked about a few times, right? How can we look at our drills in terms of whether we're creating live? Does it keep the problem solution intact? Does it present a task disposition representative component? Does it contain relevant sources of information for the athlete to regulate their movement? Does it keep perception, cognition, and action deeply intertwined? Does it maintain a practical and relevant goal as an intention to channel the movement solution? Does it allow for continuous or reorganization of system degrees of freedom? Does it require the athlete to authentically connect to the problem in their own unique way? Does it require the athlete to maintain a certain level? Does it maintain a certain level of unpredictability, requiring the athlete to actively make decisions as needed? Does it present merging and decaying affordances? Number 10, does it change in some meaningful way each time it's faced? That, i.e., does it create repetition without repetition? The more answers you get that are yes to these questions, the more you're going to get this alive problem. You're going to get this integrated movement solution emerge like you need in competition. Okay. So, continuing with implications for practice, one thing is clear: dexterity in sport does not equate to repeating a particular movement pattern more consistently or employing a given strategy more or automatically, right? It's alive. It's emergent, right? Instead, dexterity centers on the athlete being able to solve any emergent movement problem across situations, facing opponents with different capabilities or styles of movement skills, operating under various spatial temporal demands and conditions, allowing them to become one with dynamic, complex problems through interactive information transactions. Right. So creating this idea of alive, this idea of creating problems for the athlete. So I always like to say in practice, we want to give our athletes problems, not solutions. So this is something I'm working on a new presentation we've been talking about for a couple things. One, for the next baseball skill acquisition summit, which we're going to hold in October. What I want to talk about there is this idea, revisiting the idea of representative design and specificity. And I get asked, like, why would we want an athlete to swing a baseball batter to swing an extra long bat, right? We've given them a constraint that they're never, ever going to face or throw a ball that's twice as heavy as a normal ball. We've given them a constraint that they'll never face in competition, right? Because in practice, we're not trying to, in the ecological approach, we're not trying to get you to learn and repeat and automatize solutions to problems that you're going to commonly face in competition, right? What we're trying to give you practice at is doing this integrated movement solution solving problem, even if it involves solving the problem with things that you'll never place in. I want to talk about why that's beneficial and why. So it's going to be a kind of an extension of this. So that'll be coming soon. Okay. Continuing with practice design implications, when athletes solve movement problems in a highly emergent fashion, practitioners can expect the expression of a number of signature movement properties: variability, abundance, creativity, authenticity, sometimes viewed as undesirable, right? So if you're going to open up this can of worms and you're giving an athlete problems and you're not going to give them the solution, you have to be willing to accept these other things. To assist in the emergence of highly functional, authentic movement solution, coaching practitioners acting as learning environment designers should aim to guide and facilitate employing communication methods, instruction, and feedback that strive to educate their attention, pursuing perceptual attunement and intent and in the intentions of the athlete, right? So you're not trying to solve the movement technical form for them, right? You're trying to guide them in these other kind of movement solutions, right? So I think, as I said, I think this idea of movement solution. We talk about movement as problem solving, but I think this paper does a good job of following it through, putting some meat on the bones and following it through to its logical conclusion for designing practice, which we need. I still see this, we don't do a lot of alive problem solving in practice. We still need to get better at that. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled. Gone through St. Louis.